In the last lesson, we wrote some code in our API to set up our first endpoint of our ping route that we wrote a request handler for. We verified that it was working in our local, or on our local host rather, and we did an additional test using Docker, and we saw that we got that error connection refused in our browser when we attempted to do a GET request to our API. And so to understand exactly why we get this error, we're going to take a look at Docker networks, and this is a feature of Docker that gives us a seamless way to implement container connectivity. If you're using multiple containers that need to speak to each other, or if you need to speak to your container from your local machine, there is a way in Docker to do this. And so we're going to take a look at this and set it up within our Docker configuration and our Express server. The first thing is just to reiterate what's going on here. We have our local host environment where our Express server is running on. And so that's whenever we do npm run start dev, we're just starting up Node on our local machine. When that happens, as we've seen before, we get our server, which is listening on port 3000. And the important thing to take note of here is that this port that is exposed was listening for traffic on the network is within the local host. So that's on the computer or the machine that you're working on. And so now that we've implemented that ping endpoint, when we make a GET request to that specific endpoint on port 3000, everything's working fine. We're seeing our console logs being logged out. We get the response back. Everything's working fine. And so to reiterate here, it's the port 3000 is exposed on our local host, and this allows us to send a request to our Express API on this specific port, and we can initiate that GET request on port 3000 and we'll receive response. So the whole request response cycle is working within our local host environment. The problem that we're facing is within our local host environment, if we spin up our API within a Docker container, even though the Express server is running and listening on port 3000, it's isolated to the Docker network that is created when our Docker container is spun up. And so by default, Docker does not expose any ports on any networks. It does have a network by default that it is running under the hood. It's not exposing any ports to allow traffic to come through into the Docker containers. When we try and do a GET request to that ping endpoint, what's happening is on our local machine, the curl command or the request is trying to find a port on the localhost 3000 which isn't exposed because we haven't run our server technically. That server is isolated within a Docker container, and so that's kind of in its own separate world. It's not accessible by our local host, and therefore when we try and make this request, we get that error connection refused. So as I mentioned in the beginning of this lesson, Docker has a set of feature and tools that we can do a lot of useful networking jobs with. Within our Docker configuration and the way that we run our Docker container, we can adjust the Docker command to expose a specific port on the network that is created when the Docker container is spun up. And so what we're going to do is we're going to map port 3000 on our local host to port 3000 within the Docker container. So once we've kind of created this bridge where the exposed port in the Docker container has exposed 3000 and we have local host mapped to that port, we'll be able to direct any traffic from our local host through to the Docker container, which is listening on port 3000. Once we implement this will resolve the error connection refused problem that we've been getting when we try and hit our ping endpoint. And so once we've implemented this and we try and do that GET request to the ping endpoint, it's going to try and hit localhost 3000. It's going to pick up that there's a rule that we've written or we've mapped port 3000 to port 3000 container. So then it's just going to route the traffic through to that port 3000 in the Docker container. And the server is going to receive that incoming request. It'll then process it as it usually would, as we have defined within our API. I'm hoping that makes sense. A very short version of this is we're just going to create a mapping between our localhost port and the port in the container, and this will allow us to communicate from our local host into the API container as if we were making these kind of requests from our local machine. And so I've mentioned that the way that we expose these ports is by updating our Docker command. And we can do this with the -p flag. And so we simply need to add the -p flag, and then it takes in this argument which has a specific syntax. It'll take in a number which corresponds to the port on your host machine, and then colon, and then it'll be the number of the port on which you've specified within your container. So if we take a look at a sample of our Docker command that we're going to be implementing, It'll be docker run -p 3000:3000. So the first 3000 is the port on your local machine. The second one is the port within your container, and so that creates that bridge, or it maps those ports together. And then the rest of the command, which will be the name of your image, the name of your project, as well as a tag. Try and remember the syntax. The host port comes first, and then the container port will always be listed second. So that's a brief look at understanding what we're trying to do with Docker here to overcome the error that we've come across. Let's take a short break here. In the next lesson, we'll actually do the work to update the command and explore that with a more hands-on approach. So I'll see you on over there. Cheers for now.